So, good afternoon. My name is Michelle Daniel Jones, and I am the 2020 Angela White Davis Prize winner for Outstanding Public Scholarship that was given from the American Studies Association. I'm very pleased and honored to be with you all today. I have with me Dr. Zaria Davis, and we are going to do a little bit of reflection about this 20th anniversary of the publication of Angela White Davis's Are Prisons Obsolete? Dr. Davis, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. First, thank you for having me and just being able to participate in this discussion. My name is Dr. Zaria Davis. I am the owner of New Direction Coaching and Consulting, where I work with nonprofit organizations, many of them providing services within the criminal legal system, focusing on higher education as well as our pretrial justice. So just grateful to be in this space and to have this conversation today.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here with me. So, Angela Y. Davis's Are Prisons Obsolete was published in 2003. And for me, it's a critical text for any critical prison studies field. It is foundational in many ways because it defines the prison industrial complex. It excavates the prison industry's connections to global capitalism, and it is a pocketed history of prisons in the United States. Importantly, she also takes the time to highlight racial difference in ways in which white women were incarcerated compared to women of color. So powerfully, this book, calls out the roles of racism and gender discrimination, sexism, violence, and global capitalism in the making of the modern prison industrial complex. Most importantly, she brings the plight of incarcerated women to the fore, largely left out of contemporary discussions about prisons. Davis's arguments about women specifically and gender in general brings sexual and gendered violence and the racialization of the penitentiary front and center. The prison, which has been historically designed and operated with securing men of color in mind, has also been busy reifying patriarchal notions of a woman's place, criminalizing women's sexuality, and equating criminal behavior with insanity and sexualizing the so-called insane, all the while allowing the particular needs of women beyond marriage and domestic labor to go woefully unmet. When you add structural racism enacted by people of color to the customized quotidian violence on women's bodies, including sexual assault, the prison is a tool for social control and punishment and stands in high relief as a type of lived hell on earth. Here is one of my most favorite quotes out of the book. Studies on female prisons throughout the world indicate that sexual abuse is an abiding, though unacknowledged form of punishment to which women who have the misfortune of being sent to prison are subjected. This is one aspect of life in prison that women can expect to encounter, either directly or indirectly, regardless of the written policies that govern that institution. And that is so true in my lived experience of incarceration. And I'll be love to hear from you, Dr. Dr. Davis, your insights as well. One of the last things I want to say about that before we move into our discussion is, Davis's book is one of the first interdisciplinary texts to highlight the criminalization and sexuality of incarcerated women. More importantly, her interventions help us see clearly that the modern prison is run by antiquated notions of race, place, and gender subservience with regard to women. So as we look at this 20th anniversary of the book, what thoughts are you have in your mind about it?
Yeah, so first I would just say one of the things that I've always been passionate about is history. And so looking at just the thread as it relates to from slavery to where we are now, and really understanding that all of these different systems that were in place were legal, right? They were considered a part of the law.
Right,
and
right.
and they've just been used and weaponized, right, against Black bodies as a result of that. And what we've seen in the numbers more recently is targeting Black women, that increase in Black women being incarcerated, again, as you said, me being one of them, and just understanding that we haven't moved away, right, from slavery. It's just evolved into a different package. and being able to really understand that, and trying to really think as people who are in activist spaces and organizing spaces, how can we really combat this and really address the issue at hand when we know that there are financial and political gains that are connected to the prison industrial complex.
Right,
And
right.
right, I mean, what I have to explain to people a lot of times in my work is that so many people profit from the prisons, right? A lot of times people assume because they think, oh, the prisons are private, so they profit. And I said, no, even the state and federal run prisons, there's profiting that is done. You have
Absolutely.
there, you have phone, you have, all these things, right? Where they have contracts. I can remember prior to being incarcerated, there was a lawsuit around, they were trying to eliminate serving pork because so many people did not eat pork. And the pork industry sued and won. And so they still had to continue to serve pork. And I thought, are you serious? Right. But that's a reflection
Yeah.
of just how much, money is going into these systems and how much money
Yes.
is being paid. Right.
Yeah.
And so I think that in this particular text, it brings out those types of things. And we see it continuing to happen even now, 20 years later.
Yeah.
In our systems across the country.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And I think that one of the good things that this book does is remind us of how all of these parts play together. Let's talk a little bit about this idea of abolitionism, right? And having an abolitionist praxis. When Angela wrote this, Dr. Davis wrote this book, she was ahead of her time in talking about the real need to abolish prisons, right? And that are they not obsolete? One of the things that she says early on in the introduction that I thought was interesting is that she talked about how prisons were absolutely a part of our culture, normalized, and that people would think that she is completely out the box by thinking that we could live without it. But in the last 20 years, I'm excited to talk about that the idea of an abolitionist praxis, an abolitionist framework has entered into the university consciousness and thought, scholars, activists, people on the ground, community engagement. People have begun to work with that framework of an abolitionist praxis. And unfortunately it took a couple decades to get here. But what are your thoughts about, this kind of growing consciousness about abolitionism?
I love the evolution of this. I think that there's a definite difference between reforming the system and actually abolishing the system and finding restorative ways to be able to address harm. I'm an abolitionist, and I also am a really big restorative and transformative justice practitioner. And so I think for me, when I think about this and I reflect on it and seeing the growth in people identifying, right? So there are more people, there are more organizations that are coming out and saying, we realize that what we're doing is not working, and putting patches over a system that is doing harm is not helping. And
Right.
so it is important for us to be able to take this current system and say, okay, this is not working. Nothing else in our lives do we actually continue to do the same thing over and over, right? If we go to a restaurant and we get food poisoning, we don't keep going back to that restaurant, right? Like we
Exactly.
don't go. And eventually somebody's gonna come in and shut it down, like if people keep getting sick. But for some reason in this system, we continue to think that patching something up, changing something is
Yeah.
gonna fix the harm that's been done for hundreds of
Absolutely.
years.
Yeah, absolutely. I call it tweaking.
Mhm.
This non-reformist reforms are all about, you know, uh, tweaking existing systems that are quite toxic, and giving people hope is why I consider it toxic, because people think, oh, here comes some significant change that will change my quality of life under these conditions. And ultimately, it doesn't. It's just a tiny little inch. But if that inch is there, what usually happens that something is taken away, right?
Mhm.
Because as you talked earlier, this is a global capitalist movement. This is wrapped around the need to make money. So they have no deep incentive to get rid of the system as it stands. But I am encouraged by people who are starting to understand that prisons are not only constitutive of violence, which I talked about earlier about the sexual and gendered violence towards women, and men, right? You must, in order to have a prison, there is a certain amount of violence that is absolutely, written into its creation and its existence. But there are people who are starting to understand that that is not an effective way to help people who are in crisis, particularly women, right?
Yes, absolutely.
We found in our experience, in my experience of incarceration, that most of the women who came in prison, that there was a great deal of trauma wrapped right around their lives in the instance that brought them into incarceration. And then they experience the trauma of incarceration itself. And then when they get out, they're met with all these collateral consequences of criminal convictions. I certainly was. And it can actually feed people back into the carceral system. The
Absolutely.
projects I did when I was in school is I created that loop. I wanted to see that visual loop of all the ways in which this system, this carceral state, kind of feeds us in, everything from debt, everything else from the so-called war on drugs, everything else from the creation of mass incarceration to racialized law enforcement practices, taking us in and feeding us into these systems. And then when we come out, we don't get all the way out of the system because we run into all the collateral consequences that sometimes run us right back into the system. What are your thoughts about, like, who should be reading this book now? Like, the importance of this book 20 years later, as we are it's 2023 and we're battling some of the same systems that Dr. Davis talked about.
It's interesting because, I think a lot of times we try to have these arguments and debates within the systems that we all work in, meaning the people who are fighting are sharing these thoughts and feelings. But I really think that it needs to get into the hands of judges. It needs to be it should be like in all the law schools, right? So people who are going out to become prosecutors, having an understanding of like what system they're really entering into, because I think a lot of people go in with the thought that they're doing the right thing, right? They've been raised to believe that the system is doing what it's supposed to do,
Right.
in the sense of it is doing justice, right? Like people are under that impression. So you have really oftentimes people who've been sheltered that go into these, law schools, they're studying, they think they're helping community when in actuality they're perpetuating the harm, right?
Right.
And they think that by locking people up that they're keeping communities safer, but they're really doing more harm to communities by
Yeah.
locking people up, so I think that it needs to get into the hands of the people that we don't always think about, including the systems people, right? So
Right.
not just
No, that's
abolitionists,
it. Yeah.
activists, and the people who already are kind of cheering us on. And I think that right now, with so many books around justice, true justice are being banned. When we're talking about equity, when we're talking about justice, we're seeing like this trend across the country with books and reading material being banned. But really, I think it starts with our young people really, being able to be exposed to that, because what I hear, including from people who've been formerly incarcerated, who say prior to their incarceration, they thought the system, right, was doing what it was
Right.
supposed to, right?
Right. Absolutely. They do. Yeah.
So it's not just one particular subset of people that feel that way. This is how we've been conditioned as a society to think that the system is working in a way that it's keeping people safe, and it's getting the bad people right off the street, when in actuality is destroying homes, is
Right.
re-traumatizing women who've been, victims
Right.
already. And as you mentioned, that process of like layers of trauma, like my former life, I was a mental health therapist, and to see the layers of trauma for the women that I was incarcerated with, and being able to have those conversations, and knowing that such a large percent of them came in already as victims, right, in some
Right.
form, and now they're being victimized. And unfortunately, at the facility I was at, there were actually officers that were arrested for actually sexually assaulting, women that were at the facility at the time.
My facility too. So yeah.
So, so it's just like, just so to see this harm just being reinforced, like you're already dealing with a vulnerable population, and then you decide to be abusive in your state of
Right.
having that power, right? And then,
Right.
as you mentioned, going back out into the community afterwards, and that permanent punishment that we just see cycled over and over
And over
again.
and over again. Yeah.
And with very little support within the community, you know, for
Right.
men and for women coming home. And I feel like there's such a huge disparity with women coming home as it relates to access to resources and
Oh,
services, because for
absolutely.
so many reasons, people are just like, well, you know, it's not as many women. I'm like, first of all, the numbers are going up, unfortunately, and there's still people coming home. So there needs to be resources and supports to, you know, to help people to get back to, or to get to, because some of them may have never been in a state of like just feeling
Right.
secure or safe within
And
their.
actually, and to that point, the prisons does not need to be the site at all where state actors think that that's the place where we finally get help. Like,
Right.
okay, we go to prison to finally get education, to finally get health care, to finally do any kind of work on self-help, right? They have
Mhm.
to reimagine that how you help people on the front end of these situations, of the things that drive people into incarceration. But over and over, as I sit on panels or as I sit and listen to some conversations with state legislators, they're all focused on after incarceration, after incarceration, after, and that is their, you know, their drumbeat. No one wants to deal with structural racism. No one wants to deal with structural poverty. No one wants to deal with the fact that communities are being locked out of systematically access to resources and opportunity, right? No one wants to deal with that, but they rather say, okay, let's get a little library in here and let's create a little program on the back here, because it's designed to like funnel us into the system. And then I think about something else you said earlier about how, you know, judges and prosecutors need this information. Well, I also feel like that in terms of academics, right, the people who create the textbooks that the students who go to law schools and go to these schools and learn also need to level up their understanding and come out of their kind of narrow, myopic understanding of their field and their deep allegiance to their field. Because I feel like scholarly, in the scholastic world, academic world, there is such a I don't want to trash anybody's field of experience, but I do feel like there is such an attachment to things as they've always been done, information as it's always been shared, best practices as they've always been rolled out, that there is not a leveling up in this. And they wonder why recidivism is what it is, corrections is what it is, because they've been playing the same record for so long, because they've been looking at books like Are Prisons Obsolete as this sort of radical understanding of these systems. But in fact, because of someone who had lived those systems, it's like priceless information from the lived experience of someone who's gone through these systems and worked through these systems. Most of the time, academics writing about prisons, talking about educating people who are going to prosecute and send people to prisons, have never had experience of incarceration themselves to temper this us versus them ideology that recreates prosecutors and judges who come into those systems saying these are vermin and monsters of the world, as opposed to understanding systemic poverty, systemic losses, systemic trauma, you know, domestic violence, and all these things that help feed people into these systems, right? It's such a colossal disconnect. And I feel like that's why this book and many others that have fallen, that have come alongside this ideology that Dr. Davis has kind of, you know, put out there for us are so critical, but they are packaged in the social sciences, and criminologists don't see that as real scientists. I actually had one criminologist say, read some of my writing and say, well, we don't write like that.
You know, I think it's so interesting. I presented at a criminology conference several years ago about this exact issue. The first year I attended, I sat in on like an early morning session and I cringed the entire time. The use of the terminology, how they described the people they were working with, the research participants, just made me just, oh, I can't even explain how I felt. So I decided to go back and present on just how you should engage formerly incarcerated people and during that research process, and to keep in mind like triggers
Yeah.
and, you know, respect and understanding that that we're still human beings and that there should be a humanization to that engagement.
Absolutely.
And I
Absolutely.
feel, and it's such a far away perspective. And my
Because
research
they
background,
consider us criminal. They start there, and we are so othered.
yes,
They're teaching
absolutely.
generations of people to automatically other this population.
Yes. Yes, and the use of any type of humanizing language is like, what? Why would we just call them people in prison? Why would we do that? Like, why not label them? It makes it so much easier for our work because, like you said, it keeps them away from it, right? There's
Yeah,
no accountability or responsibility when you actually see people as human beings, and you
right.
feel like we need to actually take care of these mothers, these fathers, these caregivers who, when they're on the outside, are going to be, at your children's school and,
Well, and they
parents and things like that.
absolutely, absolutely, Zaria. And I think that you hit a nail on the head because they think of the person the person who might be convicted of a crime as that instant offense is causal, but crime is not causal.
Mm-hmm.
Crime never happens of itself. It is always relational, be it the
Absolutely.
family, be it the neighborhood, be it the block, be it the community, be it the city, be it the state, be it the government. It's always relational. And criminologists and some of those other folks just dive they divorce themselves from that ideology, right?
Mm-hmm.
And deal just with the person, the crime, the crime, the crime, the crime, the criminal, right? And it's such a flawed understanding of humanity. We are complex people. We're not just any of one label that you can cook up. But I think it was all about specialization and the professionalization of corrections that has led to
Mm-hmm.
this sort of myopic view of people who are impacted.
Absolutely. And I think that, when we talk about, who needs to engage in this material, I think the other piece is a lot of times people go into these environments, whether it be in law enforcement or like somewhere working within the criminal legal system because of their own trauma and hurt, right? Like, so a lot of them have unaddressed trauma and hurt. And so that's a whole nother thing, right? So we have people who maybe started out on the same path at some point, right? Same communities,
Yeah,
environments,
yeah.
but because they were like, I don't want to be like this, they felt like everything was not so great in their community. So they go to the far extreme and say, I'm going to be law enforcement and I'm just going to lock up everybody that, that I see that reminds me, right, of that
Right.
environment
No,
or that
that's true.
trauma that I
Yes,
experienced.
yes.
So I think that it is critical to really take a deeper look at some of these different areas of practice and how it really impacts. When I did that presentation, the one thing I shared was you don't understand what your work does then on the legislative side, right? So I work on the policy side. And when you're having staffers doing research, right,
Mhm.
and they're pulling these articles and they're reading these books by people and they're dehumanizing people and they're talking about people as, like you said, criminals, right? They're now writing bills and policies to reflect the things that they've written. And so
Yeah,
they don't understand the long-term effects of their writing and that research. And so listening to the voices, centering the voices, such as Dr. Davis's book of like people who have actually been impacted by the systems is critical,
right.
especially because it has such long-term implications, not just in a local community when we think about, a law enforcement person reading a book or a judge, but even when we're talking about our policymakers who are making decisions for states, for counties, for
Yes,
cities, for the
yes.
country, right? So it goes deeper than that. So it's critical that they have a overall understanding of how this system really works, and not just from a perspective of law enforcement or people that are working on the criminal legal side, but also from that perspective of people who have those lived experiences, who have been traumatized, who've had those experiences that they now have to live with for the rest of their lives.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that, and this is why this book is so important because it pushes them to the brink of asking, why have we created, why have we transplanted ideas from Europe and made them our own? And why have we insisted that this is the way in which we deal with people who might have harmed people or might have made a wrong step financially or with property? Like, why are prisons necessary in order to deal with harm in our community and society? I mean, it was a cognitive choice. And I feel like Dr. Davis's book pushes everybody to ask about that, to question and
Absolutely.
grow more critical about why they are the only way that we deal with people who are been traumatized, who have been abused, people who have or are living in stark poverty, who are addicted to drugs that they did not ship over here themselves from Mexico. I'm saying, it asks us to push further than to say, oh, this is about safety and security, right?
Right. Yeah, and it's so interesting because, like I said, I work in a pretrial side, and people use that, and I'm like, that's not how, like, for example, the bond system. It was created for people to come back because people were fleeing, but it had nothing to do with safety or security.
None.
They created bonds so that people would have some buy-in, some skin in the game, right, to
Right.
come back to court. That's it. But
That's
now
it.
it's become this whole safety thing. Like, we have to keep people locked up to keep them safe, and that doesn't prevent anything, because if people have money, they get out. And if they don't have money, they
They
stay
stay.
in.
And it's more about locking up people who are poor and keeping people who are
Absolutely.
poor in that period behind bars. Right.
Again, and it goes back to, like you said, the economic piece, right? So it's so much of it is connected to the economy, and who can afford and who can't. Even when you think about representation, when you think about who goes to trial, who doesn't, oftentimes, like, all of these things factor into it.
Absolutely.
And I think that being able to bring out these components, and for Dr. Davis to just really shine a light on it, as they say, as the new song said, shine a light on it. I think it's so important. And I think that, some books, I feel like, unfortunately, can be timeless. Like, you can read it and you pick it up and you're thinking, like, is this happen? This is happening right now. Like, this
Right.
person just wrote this book right now.
Right. And this book is one of those books.
Yes, absolutely.
Definitely one of those books. I mean, I came across the book while I was incarcerated in my undergrad courses, and I remember just highlighting it to the brink, just like, oh my God, this is my life. Oh my gosh, this is heterotopia. Oh my gosh, this is slow violence, and things that I was reading. Oh, this is the new Jim Crow. I mean, things that I was current scholars that I was reading, I was able to pull out and see the association like immediately, right?
Mhm.
Um, yeah, it's powerful in that way. So, what do you hope to tell Dr. Davis about your experience of reading her book? Who would
First
you
of all,
what would you like for her to know?
yeah, I would start with thank you, right? So thank you for having the courage to really to dig in, and to bring to light a lot of things that people oftentimes don't want to discuss,
Mhm.
that they know are there, but because of systems, because of fear, especially people impacted by the system, right? Like, there's
Right.
oftentimes fear with having a voice in these spaces. And so to really be able to elevate the voices, not just of poor people or Black people, but also women, and really bring into light, as you mentioned earlier, like that victimization, and how women are really these cycles that just exist within our communities. Just bringing that to light, I think, is so important. And I think that, for me, I'm grateful that there are people like her. I feel like we are standing on their shoulders as we continue to climb, and then bring other people up in this
Yeah.
journey of advocacy, abolition,
Yeah.
activism, how people show up in this space. And so I'm just grateful
Yeah.
for her voice. And I appreciate just the fact that I appreciate that Dr. Davis is very real. Like, we've been on a few
Yeah.
Zooms,
Yeah.
just for different groups that I'm a part of. And, like, there's not this celebrity type of
No.
energy. It's a very realness. And I think that that helps keep a lot of us grounded in this work.
Oh,
And so this book,
absolutely.
yeah, so this book, in her presence, right? The combination, I think, of both really helps with a lot of us who are newer in the space, just to elevate our voices, and to understand and know that it is okay, and that this is a fight that we have to continue to fight until we see the change that we really want to see happen.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I appreciate everything you just said because it brings me to this quote in the book that I definitely want to read in because it's about the work. And you just talked about you. Oh, it's a perfect segue. Perfect segue. So here's the quote. It says, creating agendas of, of decarceration and broadly casting the net of alternatives helps us do the ideological work of pulling apart the conceptual link between crime and punishment. This more nuanced understanding of the social role of the punishment system requires us to give up our usual way of thinking about punishment as an inevitable consequence of crime. We would recognize that punishment does not follow from crime, it follow crime in a neat and logical sequence offered by discourses that insist on the justice of imprisonment, but rather punishment, primarily through imprisonment and sometimes death, is linked to the agendas of politicians, the profit drive of corporations, and media representations of crime. And man, and is that not a call on us? Like that is our work to de-link the two in our work and what we talked about is some of the organizations that are doing that on the ground. One that comes to the mind right off the top of my head is Survived and Punished, right? This delinking from crime, the instant crime, and the fact that these women are and these men are survivors of domestic violence. Another example is the Survivors Justice Project that I work on in New York, where we're working on the implementation of the DVSJA Act, which is Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act. Again, we're trying to de-link crime from punishment so that women and men who have suffered under trauma, significant trauma of domestic violence can get out of prison and go home. And your amazing work and all of those folks that we can like name if we did a checking off of a list, I think it's important for us to know that Dr. Davis is calling us forward to do this work. And it is an honor, right, to have the opportunity to speak with her and meet with her and be in spaces with her. I've had the opportunity to be at her home and learn from her. And she is open, and she doesn't have the kind of spirit or ego of celebrity. She is a woman for the people, and it's a tremendous honor to be in conversation with you because we already know Dr. Davis is doing the thing. And, I sought you out because I know your work and I know your heart and I know your consciousness, and really just a pleasure to kind of be in the same space with you to talk about one of our major heroines in this work. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I'm appreciative that you reached out. This is a beautiful thing. The work that she's done, her life, and just her contributions, and again, how she's just poured into so many of us that are doing the work. It's a level of encouragement, I think, for me as I go through this journey. I'm doing a lot of focus on the restorative justice space. And so like that's a big piece of it in that transformative justice, like going into how do we cut it off before we get to this point, right? Where we're locking people up. So I just appreciate her contribution in this space and just how she continues to push and invest into the leadership of other women like ourselves.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's beautiful. And I think that as we move forward, she has continued to publish. She has continued to make herself available. Prisons Obsolete is an actual foundational text, pretty much in any American Studies course, any course on abolition, any course on prison histories, right? And so as we understand the icon that she is, I hope that we will do more than recognize the icon, but not listen to the icons like wisdom about direction, right? We need to be doing that delinking work. We need to be speaking with the language of global capitalism, racial capitalism. We need to be understanding how we will not dismantle this system unless we abolish the system, unless we are very serious about delinking and
Yeah.
calling out the role of capitalism in the furtherance of the carceral state on the prison industrial complex. And I think that you highlighted that really well about the work of of undoing the work of capitalism and its role in places that are like literally profiting off the trauma and harm and that someone has experienced, and maybe that individual has also experienced. It's kind of a sick, perverted, I call it the sister who wrote about disaster capitalism. I can't remember her name right now. The person who wrote about disaster capitalism is doing the same thing, saying that when there is catastrophe like trauma, like Katrina, there are people who swoop in to make money off of that. And that is all this prison industrial complex is doing. It's making money off of loss, harm, trauma, poverty in our communities. And we have to be
Naomi
proactive about
Klein.
stopping it.
Is it Naomi Klein that wrote that?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Dr. Naomi Klein wrote,
Okay.
What's the full name of the book?
I'm trying to think. I think it's called The Shock Doctrine.
Shock Doctrine. Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes.
Rise of Disaster.
Yes, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. It was a very powerful book. But you can hear in there echoes of Angela. As she talks about the ways in which profiteers swoop in on the poor and the unstable and the traumatized to make money.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we see it all too often, unfortunately.
We see it all too often.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this is our time. I'm going to stop recording, but let me say I appreciate you so much. I thank you so much. I'm going to stop recording so we can wrap up.
Awesome. Thank you.
Absolutely.